most of the battles that you and I face every day happen right here, right between our ears. Most of life's battles are won or lost in our mind. And therefore, what happens to us is really a direct result of the battles that we win or lose with our thoughts. And so we're in this series exploring how we can win more of those battles. Now, along with the Bible, I've mentioned a couple other great resources. These are available. You can find them on our app in the message notes section, but it's a book by Dr. Caroline Leaf called Cleaning Up Your Mental Mess, and if you're like me, you got a lot to clean up there. This one is a book written by Craig Groeschel. It's called Winning the War in Your Mind, which we've titled this series at, and a lot of the information that I'm sharing, thoughts anyway, big picture ideas come from some of the things that he penned in his book. So I encourage you to not just take what I say, but dig a little bit deeper in this, because this really is a big deal, and we really can win these battles. We know that our brains are very complicated. You might think that the person sitting next to you is very simple-minded, but I promise you they're not. Their minds are very complicated, just as complicated as yours is. Our brains, the thoughts that we have, create these things called neural pathways. If you can envision a bunch of roads in your mind that originate with your thoughts, and these roads, these pathways find their way all the way down through and eventually out of our bodies. Now, I know that kind of sounds kind of sci-fi, but both science and the Bible agree that what comes into your mind eventually comes out in your life. In fact, here's how the Bible puts it. There you go. Proverbs 23 says, "For as he thinks in his heart, so is he." As a person thinks, so is the way that they live their life. Whatever's going on in their thoughts often find their way in and through and out of our body. For example, you cannot have a positive life if you have a negative mind. It's impossible. You know, if your mindset is always negative, guess what your life's going to be? It's going to be very negative. Now, the flip side is that is true as well. If your outlook on life is very positive, then so will your life be very positive. As a man thinks, so is he. And so we've been working off of this big idea. The life that you live is often a reflection of the thoughts that you think. The life that you live is often a reflection of the thoughts that you think. Now, here's where this gets even more interesting. The more we have a thought, the more we have this thought or think a thought, the easier it is to think that thought again. And the more we continue to think about it, the more we think about it. And the more we think about it, it creates these ruts. These pathways become these deep-seated ruts in our lives that eventually control our lives. Now, this series, again, is about acquiring the tools that we need to change the way that we think so that we can change the way that we live. I've said this, transform your thoughts, you can transform your life. Change the way you think, you can change the way that you live your life. Now, the good news is we can do that. We can change the way that we think, and therefore we can change the way that we live our lives. And Paul, an early follower of Christ, writer of much of the New Testament, gives us some great advice on this and tells us how we can do this. In fact, here's what he says in 2 Corinthians. He says, "The weapons that we fight with are not the weapons of the world." He says, on the contrary, the weapons that we have, they have divine power. Everybody say divine power. They have divine power to demolish, everybody say demolish strongholds. And so Paul says, listen, we have this weapon available to us, this power available to us. And it's a divine power. It's a power that's not just outside of us, but it's a power that is within us. And it comes from God's Spirit that God imparts into us and puts in us the moment we place our faith and trust in His Son, Jesus Christ. This word power in the original language is the word dunamis, where we get our English word dynamite from. And so it's like this, we have this explosive power that allows us to demolish these strongholds. We've identified these strongholds as these thoughts or these thought patterns that take hold of our life, and they keep us from living the life that we were created to live, that keeps us from living the life that Jesus died to give us. So we have this divine power, Paul says, within us to demolish these strongholds, these thought patterns that are keeping us from living the life that God wants us to live. Paul continues and he says, so we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we take captive. Everybody say take captive. We take captive every thought to make it obedient to Jesus, to make it obedient to Christ. We have this power within us that allows us to demolish these arguments that we have that go on inside of our head sometimes. And we've all had them, right? We all have these fights, these mental arguments and thoughts that are just always at war, it seems like, with them. We demolish those things. And anything that sets itself up against what's real, what's true. And we take captive every thought and we make it obedient to Christ. So I want to ask you this morning. How many of you are honest enough to say, and you don't have to raise your hand, but I just want you to think, how many of you have some unwanted thoughts? Or maybe there's this one thought, or maybe there's this string of thoughts, but how many of you have some thoughts right now that you would like to take captive? I said you didn't have to raise your hand, but I've got some. Anybody else besides me have some? We all have these thoughts, don't we, that we would love to take captive, that we would love to either stop thinking them or stop living them out in our lives. We all have those kind of thoughts. Well, the good news, we can. And we're learning from Paul and his success in this area of winning the war, winning these battles with his thoughts. We're learning from him how we can do just that. And so today we're going to talk about reframing our thoughts. And so that's the tool that we're going to unpack a little bit today, reframing our thoughts. So it's been said, maybe you've heard this, we see what we want to see. We hear what we want to hear, and if we look long and hard enough, we will find what we're looking for. Now, we know that to be true, don't we? We see what we want to see. When something happens, something at work, or whatever it might be, we see what we want to see in that circumstance. And we've had conversations with other people who see something different. They see what they want to see. We hear what we want to hear. Maybe there's a conversation that's taking place. We choose to hear what we want to hear. And if we look long and hard enough, we will find what we're looking for. So there's a question that I don't want to ask you. I want you to ask yourself this morning. And the question is this: what am I looking for? What am I looking for? Ask yourself that question. What am I looking for? Now, unfortunately, what we see, what we hear, what we find is often the result of what social psychologists call cognitive bias. Cognitive bias. Now, we've all got these biases, all right? Every one of us. And in fact, I discovered just this week that I've got a whole lot more than I ever imagined that I have. But I'll give you this simple definition for it. A cognitive bias is mistakes in reasoning based on personal or past experiences and or personal preferences. So these biases that we have often cause us to misinterpret things that are going on, either because of past experiences that we've had or personal preferences that we have. The way this works is that our personal, or I'll say our past experiences and personal preferences, they often cloud our view of reality. They often cloud our view of reality. They often keep us from seeing the big picture, the whole picture. They keep us sometimes from seeing what is real and true. And so our cognitive biases, they act like mental filters, if you will. And so something happens, and we run whatever has happened through this filter in our mind, through our thought processes. And as it runs through that, we interpret it based on that. And so these filters, if you will, they shape how we think about things. They shape the way that we think about things. It's why two people can have the exact same experience and yet have two totally different responses to them. For example, two colleagues working on the exact same project side by side every single day. Supervisor walks in and gives them some constructive criticism about their work. And one responds this way and is like, just kind of blows up. I can't believe that you would say that. Do you know how hard I've worked on this? Do you know what I've put into this? How dare you say that and give me that kind of feedback? Where the other one is sitting there and going, I'm very thankful for that. That helps me tremendously. That helps me see how I can do a better job. They both heard the exact same thing, but both responded in very different ways. Same facts, different response. Or let's say two people go to church together, and literally they come to church together, and yet they have two totally different experiences. Maybe the first person comes in and they're very critical of everything. They're like, man, these people are just stuck up. These people are weird. These people, they're hypocrites. And then they start picking apart, the service. All they want is my money. And the music. Well, who caused that music? And the message. That is the most pointless message I've ever heard, where the person maybe who walked in with them and is sitting beside them has a totally different response. They walk in, man, I love this place. I love these people. They're just so friendly, so they're so accepting, they're so loving. The music, it just helps me kind of focus my thoughts and minds on God. It gives me a chance to worship God. And the message, I don't know how it happens, but the message always just seems to speak directly into circumstances that are going into my life. Both of them experience the exact same thing, same facts, same information, same everything, but yet have two totally different responses. A biblical example of this would be found in Numbers chapter 13. If you were here about a year ago, we walked through this series together. We actually followed the Israelites as they left Egypt on their way to the Promised Land. There's a story in there where they're standing on the border of the Promised Land. They're about ready to go in, and Moses says, I'm going to send some spies over, and I want you to go check out the land. And so he sends 12 guys into the land, and they spend 40 days in there walking around, sneaking around, looking at everything, and they come back, and then they give this report. And while for the most part their report was the same, it was exactly like God said it would be. It's flowing with milk and honey. It's just incredible. And so two guys are like, okay, let's do this. We got this. This is ours. Let's go claim it. And 10 other guys are like, oh, time out. We can't do this. And now they saw the same thing. They experienced the same thing, and yet they look at it and go, two guys are like, we got this. God's going to give this to us, and all we got to do is be faithful and trust God. And the other guys are like, wait a minute. There's some nice stuff over there, but did you see the cities? They're walled cities. Did you see the people who live there? They're like giants compared to us. We look like grasshoppers compared to them. That was their perception of what they saw. Again, two groups of people see the same thing, same people, same experiences, same everything, and yet walk away with two totally different responses. Why? Because of their cognitive bias, because of the mental filters that they were running everything in based on their past experiences and maybe their personal preferences. They were able and process things very differently. Your cognitive bias doesn't just filter information. It also determines how you frame the situation. How you frame the situation. And the way that a situation gets framed makes a big difference. Again, I'll give you an example. Let's say you've been diagnosed with a terminal illness. Two doctors, they come out to tell you what's next. Dr. A says with proper diet and treatment, you have an 80% chance of full recovery. Dr. B comes out and he says, well, there's a 20% chance that even after the treatments, you're going to die. Now, same information, right? But framed very differently. And the way those situations, that information gets framed makes a big difference. Now, if I were to ask you which doctor would you want to treat you, more than likely, your first thoughts would be, I want Dr. A to treat me, because an 80% chance of full recovery is better than a 20% chance of the fact that I'm going to die. Now, we know this. We get this, right? But if we're honest with each other, based on our cognitive bias, determines how we're going to process that information. For example, let's say you have a close friend who faced a similar illness but didn't make it. You're going to tend to follow Dr. B. You're going to be like, that's the way you're going to frame it. And because that's the way you're going to frame it, I only got, there's a 20% chance I'm going to die. That's the way you're going to live your life, because that's the thought pattern that you follow. Now, on the other hand, if you have somebody who had the same illness but beat it, you're going to be more like the information, the framework that you're going to live your life around is, I got an 80% chance of beating this. Now here's what we know. The person who's more positive has an even greater chance of beating their illness, because as a person thinks, so are they. It affects the way we live our life. If we're negative, we're going to view things very negative. If we're positive, we're going to view things very negative. And so our cognitive bias determines how we're going to view things. Make sense? I hope you're tracking with me. So the challenge for today, and honestly the challenge for this week and even beyond that, is for us to work on how we're going to frame the things that happen to us. To frame the way that we view things. Because the way we frame a situation determines the kind of thoughts that we have, and the kind of thoughts that we have determine the kind of life that we live. These are all connected, okay? So again, the way we frame a situation determines how, the thoughts that we're going to have, and the thoughts that we have determine how we're going to live our life. So we've been looking at the advice that the Apostle Paul gives us on how he has been winning these battles that take place even in his mind, and we're following his advice. And so today, I want to show you how Paul chose to frame a situation that he found himself in. And so I'll set it up this way. The cool thing about Paul, we get to see his entire life. We get to see what his life was like before he became a follower of Christ, and then we get to see his life up until the very end of what it looked like as a follower of Christ. So Paul meets Christ. Christ transforms his life, and Paul's all excited to make sure that everybody else has the same experience that he had, that they experience God's forgiveness and God's grace and God's power in their life. And so Paul begins to formulate a plan, and he begins to travel around to all these major cities and sharing the gospel and establishing churches there. And as he would get a church started, he would go off somewhere and leave them to grow, and he'd start another one. And then Paul thought, you know what? This is working really well. What if I went to Rome? In fact, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to Rome because it's like the major hub over here. And if I can get in there and lead a bunch of people to Christ, the gospel will, the message of Jesus Christ will spread very quickly throughout the entire world. If I could just get there. And so Paul has this plan. I'm going to eventually go to Rome. And when I get there, I'm going to preach to the masses. And as a result of that, the gospel is going to spread very quickly. Well, things didn't quite turn out the way that he had planned. Ever have that happen to you? You have big plans. You have this great idea about how things are going to work out for you. And so you put this plan in place. You go to college. You go to college, you get a degree. Excuse me. And you think, okay, then I'm going to get a great job. I'm going to make good money, and I'm going to enjoy life. Well, you go to college, you get your degree, But instead of making a bunch of money, you find yourself owing a bunch of money. And instead of being in a great job in the field that you find yourself, you're working at a job that you're way over educated for. Life doesn't quite always work out the way that we plan. Maybe your thoughts were, man, I'm going to get married. I'm going to marry my sweetheart. We're going to do life together. We're going to have a great family together. But instead, you find yourself separated or maybe even divorced. Life doesn't quite turn out sometimes the way that we think it should, or the plans don't always work the way that we hope that they will. Well, this is where Paul finds himself. Things haven't turned out the way that he thought they would. Instead of being there and preaching to the masses, Paul finds himself in prison. He finds himself in prison. And we get to see how Paul frames this, because even though things didn't work out the way that he wanted, Paul still had to kind of live with his. In fact, let me just show you how Paul framed this. This is found in the WV version. It says, now, Paul speaking, now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me really sucks. I had this plan, but it didn't work out the way that I wanted to. In fact, it just sucks, to be honest with you. He says, as a result of the hell that I've been through, I'm quitting small group. I'm no longer going to serve at my church. In fact, I'm not even going to go back to church. Now, many of us would respond that way, wouldn't we? Now, if you're looking up the WV version, some of you are thinking you had to make that up. That's probably the West Virginia version, my home state. That's not what that is. Let me tell you what, it's the Whiners version. And it doesn't exist. So if you're looking for it, you're not going to find it. But let's be honest. This is the way we respond to things in our life that don't go according to plan, don't we? We start whining. Woe is me. Life stinks. It didn't work out the way that I'd planned, and we just begin to. So I'm quitting. I'm quitting God. I'm quitting church. I'm no longer going to serve. In fact, I'm not even going back to church anymore. And this is often the way that we respond to the circumstances and situations that don't go according to our plans. Now, this isn't the way Paul responded. Let me show you how Paul really responded. He says, now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. Paul's like, okay, I had this plan, but it didn't quite work out the way that I had planned. In fact, if I had to choose, this wouldn't be the way that I would choose for it to play out. But here's the deal. It's actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become very clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains. Why? For Christ. Not because of something wrong that I did, but actually because of something right that I was doing. And he says, and everybody knows that, even the guards. He says, listen, I'm in prison. But yet every single day, in fact, every 6 to 8 hours, they bring in a new guard and they chain me to him. And guess what I get to do for the next 6 or 8 hours? I get to tell him about Jesus. I get to tell him about the difference that God has made in my life. So who's really in prison here? Kind of see where he's going. This is how he chooses to frame it. And he says, as a result of this, he said, I had this plan, but God had a different plan. And he said, so as a result of that, he said, I'm not only, I'm witnessing and sharing my faith with some very influential people who have some really interesting connections and great connection. In fact, every time he would lead one of these palace guards to Christ, guess what that palace guard would do? They would go tell somebody else. Probably some people who are in very influential places. And so Paul says, this is actually working out very well. In fact, he goes on and he says this. He says, and because of my change, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident. Everybody say confident. Have become confident in the Lord. Because of my circumstances, people are more confident in God himself, in Jesus Christ, in the Lord, and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. He says, look, they're looking at my circumstances, and he says they're finding confidence in God, and as a result of that, they're daring that much more to share their faith with other people. He says things are actually working out really well. Now, Paul could have been very discouraged. And I'm sure that there were some very negative thoughts that Paul was dealing with at different times. Because he's human just like us, because we know from the things that we've read about Paul that there were some battles that went on in his thought life as well. But Paul finds himself in this situation where things didn't turn out quite the way he had planned. And yet he chooses, instead of framing and focusing on the negative, finds the positive to look at. Now, I want to show you, hopefully in a very practical way, of how this looks. So we're going to put this image up on the back screen as Ed moves the TV out of the way. And so as you see this image up here, this image kind of represents any given day in our life. There's a little sunshine. There's a storm, okay? Now, the way we choose to focus on this has a lot to do with our cognitive bias, okay? If we're by nature a more positive person, here's what we're focused on over here, the sunshine. Yeah, there's a storm coming, but we know that storm's only going to make this part of the picture look even better. The rain's going to make the grass more greener, the trees more greener, things are going to grow. You know, that's okay, rain's coming, but it's all good. Now, the other way that you could focus on this, and some people often frame this picture, is they frame and focus on the storm. All they see is the storm that's coming. And it just kind of ruins their day. They're bummed out about it. The whole day's ruined. You know, I can't believe that this my day off and this is what I got to deal with. So here's the deal. All of this exists at any given time, okay? Any particular day, there's always a little good, a little bad. Sometimes there's a lot of good and a little bad. Sometimes there's a lot of bad, but believe it or not, there's always some kind of good that's going on there as well. But based on our cognitive bias, determines on how we often frame that. And so if you tend to frame more of this side of the picture, I want to talk to you and encourage you and hopefully give you some very practical advice how you can reframe your thoughts so that you can see a bigger picture potentially at play. So here's what I want to do. I want to give you 3 practical ways of reframing your thoughts. 3 ways that you can reframe your thoughts. The first one is this. Thank God for what didn't happen. Thank God for what didn't happen. So there's this story about a freshman girl. She's second semester of college. She calls home one day and gets mom and dad both on the phone, and she's like, Mom, Dad, I've got some bad news. In fact, you might want to sit down for this. I went to a party recently, and I met this guy, and in fact, we hooked up at the party, and I'm pregnant. Now, he's on probation, but that'll be over within a year. He wants to marry me as soon as he can, as soon as he's done with rehab and he's able to find a job and move out of the shelter that he's in and find a place for us to live. So she throws that out there, and then she just leaves it hanging for a moment. And then she says, Mom, Dad, I want you to know that none of that is true. None of that actually happened. What really happened is I failed my English exam. I just wanted you to know that things really could be worse. So, how do you think they were framing the situation at that moment? They were very thankful for what didn't happen, right? Okay? So, just a fun way for us to think about this. So often we're so focused on what happened that we miss what didn't happen. All right? We focus in on this one part of the situation, of this one part, and we miss the bigger picture. So what if we began to be thankful for what didn't happen? Lil, who opened up our time together today, I remember stories about her dad, and even up until he took his last breath here, people would often ask him, how are you doing? How's it going for you? And his response was always, could be worse. could be worse. You know, the truth of the matter is, no matter what you find yourself in, situation you find yourself in, no matter how bad you think it is, it really could be worse. And sometimes if we just stop and kind of think about that and we become thankful for what didn't happen, it can change the way we frame a situation. It can frame what we choose to look at and focus on. Actually it wasn't a couple weeks, it was a week ago today. Every Sunday morning before we start the production team, we meet together and we stand in a circle and we talk about what's going to happen. We share prayer requests, and then somebody always leads us in prayer. And last week, Charles Fitzgerald was leading us in our prayer time, and he said something that just stuck out to me. I thought, wow. And it made me rethink some things. But here's what he says. He says, God, we thank you for what we know that you did. We thank you for what we know that you did. But we also thank you for what we don't know that you did. Isn't that amazing? I just thought, now, if you know Charles, you know that this is just his outlook on life. He's very quick to say, okay, yes, that happened, but look what didn't happen. And often as he would come into my office from time to time, he's the first one to remind me of those kind of things. And so what if we began to be thankful and thank God for what didn't happen in our lives? Practice that. Okay, sure, your son, your daughter was in an accident. I have a son that had 3 accidents. And while each time once it was his fault, the other 2 times it wasn't, but there was a lot of damage. It was very expensive to get the vehicle fixed. And oftentimes I focused on that, but then I had to stop and think, I'm thankful for what didn't happen because somebody could have got hurt really bad. And so I'm thankful that didn't happen. The car can be fixed. I'll eventually recuperate from the debt. But I couldn't recuperate if he had lost his life. So be thankful for what didn't happen. The second thing, very practical thing that we can do is this. Thank God for what didn't happen, but also practice pre-framing. Practice pre-framing. Predetermine how you're going to face your day. Now, tomorrow morning, you'll get up, and it's Monday. How many people love Monday? Exactly. 2 of you. That's because you obviously don't work anymore, and you get to stay home and do nothing, but that's okay. And he's shaking his head, yes. But we get up, and we look at our schedule for Monday, and we're like, oh, what a day. I got all these meetings. My to-do list is way more than I got time to do and get accomplished. And so if that's the way we start a day and that's the way we pre-frame our day, then we're in for a pretty lousy day, aren't we? But if we get up and go, okay, yeah, I got a lot to do today, a lot to get done, I got a lot of meetings to attend, but you know what? I'm going to make this a very productive day. I'm going to be as productive as I can in these meetings. I'm going to get as much done as I possibly can on my list. And if that's the context of the frame in which we frame our day, you'll be surprised not only how much better your day will go, but how much more you really will get done. So practice this idea of pre-framing your day. Predetermine how you're going to approach a situation. So last Sunday, last Sunday, I thought Sunday morning I was real excited when things were done. I was excited about the message and just the way I was able to communicate it. The whole morning, just everything flowed really well. Was having a great day up until about an hour and a half, 2 hours after the service was over. And I got a phone call from somebody and they said, well, do you want the bad news now or later? And so they shared some information with me that began to wreck my day, just to be honest with you. It wasn't the kind of information I wanted. It wasn't anything life-threatening, anything like that, but just some people doing some things that they shouldn't have been doing. And so now I'm stuck dealing with that. And so I knew that I needed to have a conversation with somebody. Now, because of my cognitive bias, I'm a person who doesn't trust people. All right? My first reaction is to, in fact, I even said to my wife, I said, this is why I don't trust people right here. and walked out of the house. And she probably remembers that. But that's just the way I think. And so for the next day and a half, I processed this. And I kept, God kept, with the way his Holy Spirit works in us, kept reminding me of all this stuff I've been talking about and working on and going, okay, Jeff, here's how you framed it. How can you pre-frame it? And I'm like, God, I don't want to pre-frame it. I want, and so this battle goes on in my head. And I process that way for a couple days. And finally, I start working on this week's message again. And I'm reading back through this book. And I get to this last page in this last chapter that kind of goes along with the stuff we're talking about today. And here's what I read. If you are nervous about the challenging conversation that you need to have with a friend, try to pre-frame it with faith. Instead of imagining a blow-up, thank God ahead of time for your friend and for giving you the words to say. Decide you're going to do the right thing and trust God with the results. To which I quickly went, forget that. Actually, I thought, really, God? You're going to use my words against me? Because I've always big on, we're responsible to be obedient. God is responsible for the results. And he's like, do the right thing and trust God with the results. And I'm like, oh. So I start pre-framing the situation and the conversation that I'm going to have with this person. And eventually I did have that conversation and things went really well. Things ended the way that we would want them to do. But isn't it amazing how we do that? And so I just want to encourage you, pre-frame, practice this pre-framing. One last thing, and that's this. So again, thank God for what he didn't do, practice pre-framing. And the last one is look for God's goodness. Look for God's goodness. Two people were having a conversation one day, and one guy looks at the other guy and says, I don't know how you always see God at work in this situation. In fact, I don't see how it's even possible. And the guy says, listen, to be honest with you, I can't not see God at work in this situation. Isn't it true? Listen, if we're not looking for it, we're not going to find it. Because we see what we want to see, we hear what we want to hear, and if we look long and hard enough, we will find what we're looking for. So let's begin to look for God's goodness in the circumstances around us. Instead of focusing on just a small part of the picture, let's focus on the whole thing and see what God might be up to. Let's look for God's goodness in that. For the last 13 months, it's been very challenging for all of us. And the other day I was sitting down, I was looking for a picture. I was actually looking for a picture that we might be able to use for up here. And so I start scrolling through all these pictures on my phone, and I was amazed at what I was looking at, because what I was looking at on my phone didn't match what I was feeling inside about the last 13 months. And as I began to look at these pictures, I even said something to my wife. I said, it's amazing, outside of these pictures, what I remember and what I think about over the last 13 months has been a very ugly, hard, trying time. And yet I look at these pictures and it's just the opposite. There's a lot of good things that actually took place, a lot of great things that happened. Yeah, we got COVID, but we got to spend almost 9 weeks together, isolated in the house. We had some great conversations with each other, time to talk about things that we haven't had time to talk about. We had great times with our boys and our grandkids, and those pictures just reminded me of that. And as I looked at them, I was like, you know what? Yeah, it was a tough year, but there was a lot of good things that took place in that. I began to see God's goodness. So what if we begin to look for God's goodness in all of this? So let me ask you this. What are you looking for? What are you looking for? How are you framing the events of your life? There was a song that came out, I don't know, a month or two ago. The song is called Fires. And it's become one of my favorite songs right now, but as I was listening to the opening lines to the chorus, I thought that could be framed in a couple of different ways. So the opening line of the chorus says, "You've walked me through fires." And as I thought about that, it was like, we can look at that and it be a negative thing. God, you led me through this stuff. You allowed me to walk through this stuff. Or a very positive thing, God, storms happened, but you led me, you walked me through those. So it really determines how we frame things. And so I want to ask you this morning, how are you framing things? And as you think about that, I want you to just take a moment and listen and watch this video.
I remember how you told me that life may not be easy, and everything that I need, you've already given me. I remember how you told me I can trust you completely. So why am I doubting when you prove that you'd fight for me? You've walked me through fires, pulled me from flames. If you're in this with me, I won't be afraid. When the smoke billows higher, oh, and higher, and it feels like I can barely breathe, I walk through these fires, 'cause you're walking with me. I'm changed by your mercy, covered by your peace. I'm living out the victory. Doesn't mean I won't feel the heat. You've walked me through fires, pulled me from flames. If you're in this with me, I won't be afraid. When the smoke billows higher, oh, and higher, and it feels like I can barely breathe, I walk through these fires, 'cause you're walking with me. I can face anything, 'cause you're here with me. I can do all things, 'cause you strengthen me. I remember how you showed me the price of my redemption. Lord, how could I question when you prove that you died for me? You've walked me through fires, pulled me from flames. If you're in this with me, I won't be afraid. When the smoke billows higher, oh, and higher, and it feels like I can barely breathe, I walk through these fires.
So the way we frame the events that happen in our life determine the thoughts that we have. And the thoughts that we have determine the way we live our lives. Listen, we cannot control what happens to us, but we can control the way that we respond to those events. So I want to leave you with one final image, one that I hope that will make sense. And so I asked you the question, what are you looking for? So let me show you this picture. Two birds that we're very familiar with, a vulture, buzzard, and a hummingbird. Both of these birds spend their entire day looking for something. This guy looks for the bad, doesn't he? This guy spends his day looking for something sweet. They spend their entire days looking till they find what they're looking for. So how are you going to spend your day? How are you going to spend your day? Would you stand with me as we close in prayer this morning? Father, thank you for your goodness. Thank you for your grace. God, I thank you that we can win this battle in our minds. God, that we can take captive those unwanted thoughts and we can make them obedient to the truth of Jesus Christ. And so, God, I pray that you would help us reframe our thoughts. God, help us to take the tools that we're learning throughout this series and take captive those thoughts. Because, God, we know that the way we think determines the way that we live. But, God, we also know that Christ came and gave his life for ours, not to just give us eternal life, but an abundant life now. And, God, the only way that we can live and experience that kind of life is by looking for your goodness and seeing your goodness in the middle of the storms that often take place in our life. Father, I love you and I praise you, and I trust that you will do what only you can do in each of our lives. And I pray and ask this in Christ's name. And we all agree together and said, amen. God bless you. Have a great week. We'll see you next Sunday.